Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Bárbara Simão, and I work as a program officer at Arco 19, and I will be the moderator today. Thank you especially for being here right after lunch. We'll make sure to have an exciting and interesting discussion to keep everyone awake. And we're looking forward to the panel today. Our panel is called Clouded and Concentrated, Examining the Digital Foundations of Freedom of Expression. And we wanted to discuss this today specifically because freedom of expression is usually talked about and thought about in terms of content. So what content gets removed, taken down, or promoted, and what rules govern this space of this digital sphere. And we wanted to go one layer deeper into the digital infrastructures that most of the platforms we now know run on. Cloud infrastructure is the foundation of almost everything we know as democratic communication. Government platforms, research institutions, civil society tools, newsrooms, and public services. And independent media is also an important part of the story. It is both a user of this infrastructure and also a producer of the information that democracies need. Now, this is also concentrated in a very few providers like AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, and that's how the internet's built today. But how these dependencies create new vulnerabilities for freedom of expression in democratic societies. We're here to discuss this today, and also how generative AI makes this even more complex, considering the compute dependencies needed for training and running large AI models, and also the fact that they use content as training data, and what publishers, journalists, civil society organizations, or academics produce flows upstream into the AI systems. Governments are starting to respond to this, and in the EU, we have a few frameworks at place. We have the European Media Freedom Act, which protects editorial independence and media pluralism. You have the Digital Markets Act, which targets gatekeepers and is designed around platform competition. We have the Cloud and AI Development Act, now being discussed, which addresses cloud interoperability and systemic risks for critical providers. But how can these existing and being discussed regulatory frameworks apply to vertical integration across cloud and AI systems? And what governance models could ensure that infrastructure providers remain accountable to human rights standards? That's what we're going to explore today. And for this, we have a really great team of panelists, starting with Agustin Ferrari Brown, who's a PhD researcher at the Yogosol Consortium, affiliated with the Media Studies Department at the University of Amsterdam. His doctoral research focuses on the politics of digital infrastructures in the European news media ecosystem, and his research interests include political economy of media, media theory, and the cultural logics of digital capitalism. We also have Willem Vermoost, who leads the European Broadcasting Union's work on the transition to IP-based studio infrastructures. With more than 25 years of experience in the broadcast industry, he contributes as an expert and project manager to international strategic initiatives, expert groups, and industry events. He has been involved in various proof-of-concept projects and the JTNM test program, and previously initiated the European Broadcasting Union LIST project. He currently works on the European Broadcasting Union Dynamic Media Facilities and the MXL project, where he chairs the Requirements Council. We also have Sandrine Hermy-Hercy, who's the head of the Open Internet Unit at the French National Regulatory Authority for Electronic Communications, ARCEP, where she leads initiatives on open internet regulation, data interconnection, and eco-design requirements for digital players. She coordinated the recent work of ARCEP on generative AI impacts on open internet, and she holds a master's degree in public policy from Sciences Po Paris. Corinne Kath is an anthropologist of technology with a background in cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and internet governance. In the past, she worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Delft and as the VP of Research at the Open Tech Fund, an organization that supports open source technologies. Corinne is the head of Global Team Digital at Arco 19, the team responsible for leading the organization's work on technical infrastructure and standards. She also holds a PhD and a master's degree from the University of Oxford. So without further ado, let's start our discussion today. And before talking about regulation and governance more specifically, let's take a step back and let us all understand how we got here. So, Agustin, can you please walk us through this historical arc and how did cloud concentration become a structural dependency? And also, why does it matter that we think about the infrastructure of information production?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me? Yes. There we go. Yeah, well, thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you to Article 19 for inviting me to this panel for a very necessary discussion. As you mentioned, I'm writing my PhD on the politics of infrastructure in European news media, and that specifically focusing on the adoption of cloud, because over the last decade and a half, the virtual totality of European news media has become cloud-based. So I think that that's a problem for reasons I will detail in a moment. But before problematizing that, I wanted to understand how did we exactly get here? And how does that relate to wider processes that are shaping the European media ecosystem at large? So as most of you probably know, not just European, news media in general is in a state of financial and epistemic crisis for the better part of the last 2 to 3 decades. If you're like me, pushing 30, basically you have never met a media ecosystem that is not in a state of crisis in one way or another. And a lot of that had to do with the process that we know as platformization and how new channels of information distribution changed the politics of access to content and kind of like who was able to produce what. And that created a profound crisis for the sector, and a crisis of which they haven't really gotten away from. And cloud provision is part of that, and not part in the sense of cloud being an extension of platforms, but rather cloud is a different element, is a structural change in the infrastructure, infrastructural change that emerges from the efforts from the news media to try and outsource their infrastructure to somebody else. So basically what a lot of media companies saw was the offer of a couple of mostly American companies, the hyperscalers that I think we're going to discuss quite at length during this panel. So we're thinking about Amazon, we're thinking about Microsoft, we're thinking about Google, who came to them and said, actually, you can outsource your infrastructure to us and we'll maintain it. And most people took that bargain. So part of my research was to understand why they did so. And a paper that I published a couple of weeks ago called Reliable and Cheap, I go on to explore how those two categories, reliability and cheapness, were mobilized to justify this choice. So basically, when I went and I talked to over 13 different media organizations in the Netherlands and in France, and this goes from like big public sector media and media conglomerates to smaller media companies, and all of them kind of said the same thing. Basically, they said, we did this because this is reliable and this is cheap. And what they mean by that actually is quite interesting, because it looks uncomplicated, but behind that there is a profound infrastructural transformation. Because what they meant by reliability was having access to the top-of-the-shelf hardware and software services that were provided by these third parties, while also being able to outsource the maintenance of those services to other people. And the outsourcing there is very important because it's not simply a question of not being depending on your own workforce, but also if something goes wrong, you can basically blame your provider. So that's something I remember I was talking to. Towards the end of my research, I was talking to the CTO of a media company, and it was in the Netherlands. And I said, well, but actually, all of Dutch media runs on Microsoft Azure. What happens if Azure goes down? And he said, well, yeah, we'll also go down, but if that happens, the chaos will be so big that nobody will blame us. And if you're making a decision, obviously that makes sense, right? Because like you're outsourcing your responsibility to somebody else. So that is one of the dimensions of reliability. Then you have the question of cheapness. And again, the question of cheapness is quite interesting because people, when they think about cheapness, they say, well, no, we don't have to pay for the machines, we don't have to pay for the service. But that's not really what media companies mean when they say that the cloud is cheaper than the alternatives. What they actually mean is that it is cheaper because it allows them to focus on whatever they consider that brings value to them. So that can be the production of content, but that can also be, gathering and processing of user data to do targeting advertisement. That's something that would be really hard for them to develop internally, and for most smaller media companies, flat out impossible. With the cloud, they can access these types of services and adjust their their offer to what they consider is expected in a platformized ecosystem dominated by the same companies that provides them with cloud infrastructures. So that's the first band of cheapness. The second band of cheapness is the fact that they don't have to hire people anymore. And this is really important for the second part. But basically, when you talk to people, they said, well, we were really struggling to get back-end engineers. They were very expensive. We didn't want to put resources there. We used to run with teams of 6 to 10 people. Now we just outsource everything, and we have like 1 or 2 persons to make sure that everything works. But we don't need to have those very expensive people. And obviously, said like this, it makes sense. It was a very rational choice in a moment of crisis, in a moment where the media had to make hard decisions. But I do think that it reveals a kind of like depoliticized way of thinking about infrastructure that is profoundly problematic. And I think that this problem is declined on 3 levels, and that's something that we explore with Corinne here in a chapter that we published earlier this year. But very briefly, there are 3 levels where we think that this type of approach to infrastructure is problematic. There is, first of all, the most well-known one, which is the security issue. So cloud infrastructure can be used to push as a lever of pressure over organizations, and that's something that we've seen recently with the way in which the Trump administration weaponized Microsoft Azure against the workers of the International Criminal Court who were persecuting Israel for the genocide of the Palestinian people. So that has already a very concrete effect of cutting off people, and can also have a chilling effect for media companies. So even if nothing happens, the fact that it could potentially happen already is a problem for freedom of expression. And that's kind of like the most well-known one. And it's not just a problem for US companies. If tomorrow we were to have a sovereign cloud from the EU that was able to reproduce one-on-one what AWS would do, you would still have that problem, only that instead of whoever, like the board of Amazon, you would have the board of this new company, but that is a structural problem of the infrastructure. That's the most well-known one, but I think there's 2 that are more subtle. And one is a question of dependency on infrastructural level. And that dependency means that when you're relying on these 3 companies, and these 3 companies are oligopolies that are shaping very much the market, they get to decide not only the prices, which is a big problem. We're talking with Willem already that they've been ramping up prices in a quite a radical fashion lately, which is taking a toll for media companies, but it also means that you're losing your capacity to contest technologies. So basically, these companies have such a power to shape the market that when they decide to roll out a technology, let's say, for example, generative AI, the media doesn't really have the capacity to respond in a way that is not simply creating guidelines. And finally, because I'm already running out of time, there is a third element, and this third element I think is the most important to think about the future of one in Europe, and it's basically that the cloud, this type of cloud adoption that happens not only in the media but across different sectors, again, Corinne has written about these, leads to a level of de-skilling, because those 10 people that were used to work for the media, who, I mean, they're fine, like either they got into retirement or they're going to consultancy, like they will be fine, but their expertise is not being replaced. And when you lose that expertise, then it becomes much, much harder to actually think about to alternative infrastructures and have the knowledge necessary to make those wishes reality. So I think there's a lot of talk here about what it would take from a regulatory and policy standpoint to make alternative infrastructures possible. But if we don't have the human talent to make that possible, it will not work. So this is why I think that media companies adopted the cloud, and why I also think that it can be problematic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Augustine. It seems like we have a structural problem with deep roots, and I wanted also to understand what does it look like for those who are operating inside it. So, Willem, I know that the European Broadcasting Union has been building a concrete response to the scenario that Augustine said, the media exchange layer. And can you tell us what made that necessary and what it offers as an open internet open source alternative to hyperscaler dependency?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here on the panel. And Augustine, thanks to you, I just realized why I'm passionate to work on this project, really. So let's try to do so. If the guys at the back are so keen to bring up the slides, thank you. So DMF, Dynamic Media Facilities, that sounds a little bit like an ad for something. So let's try to See if we can advance the slides. Yes. So a few years ago, we brought a paper to the public saying, well, this is the digital media value chain. And I hope it's up there, yes. And it's a very simplified version of what we call how we produce content and bring it to the public at home. So of course, first of all, we need to plan for something, whether it's to produce a news article or to plan for a show. Then we commission it, whether we do it externally or we produce it ourselves, it depends. We produce it, we distribute it, and then now with modern technology, we can analyze who's watching it, right? And this is one of the problems that we have today. With these new technologies out there, AI and so forth, one of the key values as a public broadcaster that we have is, of course, trust. If we don't bring true news to the public, what are we? Then if trust is gone, we should be gone as well. So trust, that's number one, but also how to stay connected. With the digital shift or how you consume media at home, it's not via the antenna anymore, right? You pick and choose via the internet what you want to see at what point in time. This means that distribution channel has completely shifted. Now, this shift, for many public broadcasters, this was already step one. How do we produce these outlets and these portals? Well, let's move into the cloud. Well, that was a short one. I think BBC iPlayer, the whole of BBC runs in the Amazon cloud, as an example. VRT, Belgian public broadcaster, Dutch-speaking language, also Amazon cloud. And the pressure goes on because, well, we just see that we cannot connect to our audience anymore. So trust is still there, but the youngsters, they don't follow us. Middle-aged, they don't follow us. So how can we get them in? This means we need to produce more and differentiate more in order to get our audience back. Now, this means we need to transform how we produce in another way. And the shift we see in distribution now shifts as well in production. How can we produce faster, better, and more efficient and productive? There are a few things we can think about. Instead of having a specific person that does a specific job, try to combine functions in one person, right? Or we can optimize the layout of the buildings. Many broadcasters are building new buildings as we speak, so that's an opportunity. But let's try to focus on the bits and the bytes. How can we change this? So with the EBU, we created a vision document. It's called the Dynamic Media Facility, and we realized that with the old technology that we're using today, we're not efficient. We always build for the peak. There's elections, there's Olympics, and those boxes, they are not shareable. So we're looking in IT technology to help us out in this one. Now, of course, when we move into IT, the big companies are keen to get us in, but it feels like Hotel California. You know to get in, but there's no way to get out again, right? So how can we work on this? Well, we said, how do we produce content? Well, actually, there's a life cycle to this. You start to design your show, to plan for it, to provision. You book your camera people, your studio floor, your anchor that provides or tells you the news, and so forth. But if we do this in a digital way, we just need to put some technology stack towards this life cycle. So this paper describes a technology stack as well. When we move into IT for production, then we need to have infrastructure, a host platform, a container platform, and on top of pure IT, we start to build our media-specific applications. Of course, security needs to be in. That's a cross-cutting concern, I would say. Monitoring, orchestration, and all those things. But now you see, when you move into IT, all these layers, if you don't talk about standards or open specifications, everybody can lock you in at every layer, right? So how can we work on this? We thought at the EBU, maybe we'll start with one small project called the media exchange layer. How these media functions, and you can think about it as a vision switcher or something that doesn't EQ or compression as an audio system. How can we make these media functions in a cloud system talk to each other? If we can standardize this, then at least we're already on a good path. And if we can detach this from whatever hardware platform it's running on, as commodity as possible, then we're not tied into any specific cloud provider. So that's called the media exchange layer. It's an open source SDK. We can leverage CPUs and GPUs, and we want to be compute efficient with this algorithm. So for us, it's also a little bit the cornerstone of what's also a big topic at the EBU, that's sovereignty. How can we make sure that we can run this on-prem, on our own cluster, or in any of the European or whatever cloud out there? So how would it look like? And that might be not your cup of tea, but this is the flexibility that we're aiming for. Usually multiple productions are going on at the same time. And now instead of having boxes that we buy from the market, we want software that we can deploy and interact in an open fashion with each other. So on the left-hand side, you see our little media functions. We want to deploy them as a function of the productions that we want to do this day. And tomorrow, maybe there's elections or the Olympics, and then we need to have all this compute available for us for a bigger show. And this type of efficiency, that's what we're looking for, and this will reduce the cost, because the cost pressure that we're getting makes it very difficult to be on air every day and to make sure that you guys get the right news that you really want to see. So it's not a simple problem, because once you're moving into the IT, and my apologies, I'm an engineer as a background, you can already see schemas and a lot of complexity. Well, the base blue layers, that's IT. In our industry, we're not going to build anything specific anymore. That's just what we want to buy from the industry. And there are specific things that we need to think about in our industry, but come on, the IT industry has solved this. The media exchange layer, that's a project that we already started. It's open source. We got a lot of the vendors out there, the broadcast vendors in the open source project. We've been running for 1 year, and we've already seen last month 15 companies implementing this open source code in their application. So I think we're on a positive way and on a good way. But on top, there's a lot of challenges where we can experience another lock-in. There's, of course, the applications, the UI, the orchestration, all these nice things. We need to be on the lookout to make sure that we're still in the right direction. So that's a little bit the pitch I wanted to do, how from this perspective, the broadcasters are looking at it, not to be locked in a certain cloud, and make sure that we can decouple us at any point. Et voilà.
Thank you. Thank you, Willem. That's a really interesting perspective. As someone with a background in law, it's really interesting to see how the engineering aspects also work and how we can reduce cost pressures, especially in the media sector. Now we will talk about the regulator's point of view with Sandrine specifically. And so, Sandrine, what do you think are the biggest concentration risks across the AI value chain? And what do you think generative AI do to the dependencies facing those who produce and distribute information in the public interest?
Thank you. So maybe to start a little bit on regarding where I'm speaking from. So as it was mentioned, I had the Open Internet unit at ARCEP, the French regulator for electronic communications. So the main focus of my team is to monitor compliance with net neutrality rules on telecom infrastructures. So concretely, it means ensuring the absence of discriminatory practices in the telecom layer, preventing users to access to an open internet, which is defined by the EU regulation as the possibility to access and share freely services and content online. So the rationale behind net neutrality rules and open internet principle is both economic and democratic, because this principle is essential to ensure a permissionless innovation on the internet, but also to have the ground, the essential infrastructure to exercise fundamental freedom, including freedom of expression and communication. And more importantly, for today's discussion, at ARCEP, we've been advocating for years now that preserving the openness of internet should not be limited to telecom networks alone. So we published different studies, reports, highlighting that telecom operators are not the only players capable of becoming gatekeepers for access to online content and services. It seems quite obvious today, 4 years after the adoption of the DMA, but it wasn't necessarily the case a few years ago. And we also work on outlining the relevant tools from the electronic communications regulation that could be used to reply to some of the issues raised by other digital intermediaries. And thus, in that perspective, after search engines, social media, operating systems, and of course, cloud and other infrastructure providers, today, generative AI services are becoming a new layer of intermediation and potentially a new layer also for gatekeeping on the internet. And so to address these issues, ARCEP published last January a report on the impact of generative AI on the openness of internet. It is a work based on auditions, but also a set of tests on generative AI services led with PEREN, so the French Center for Digital Regulation. And what we outline in this report is, of course, the rapid diffusion of generative AI services, but also their vertical integration into other already largely used digital services, including search engines and social media, to name a few. And what is quite fundamental is that generative AI is changing the way users interact with their online content and services. So with search engines, social media, users still navigate between different sources of information, even if these sources are ranked by an algorithm. But with generative AI services, users increasingly receive directly generated answers to their prompts. So the provider no longer only rank or organizes the visibility between sources, but it generates the response itself. And it can largely depend on the model training parameters and commercial practices. And this evolution naturally limits users' capacity to access to the content and of their choice on the internet. And on the side of content providers, so including media creators and digital commons, for instance, generative AI also creates major challenges in terms of visibility and economic sustainability. So beyond the important discussions at European level on copyright and value sharing, we highlight in this report two important issues that I would like to share with you today. The first one is the need to develop robust and interoperable technical standards on data collection practices and payment mechanism. So we highlight the need to allow content providers to express granular conditions regarding the use of their content by AI models. So both training for the training and inference phases, but also were relevant to have a compensation mechanism. This also means limiting unrestrained crawling practices. And the second, to not be too long, is the second important issue we highlight in this report is the importance to work specifically on the relationship between generative AI and the media sector to ensure that generative AI do not reduce access to a plurality of sources of information to users, which are, of course, essential for the democratic debates. And on this, we see the development of bilateral agreements between the major publishers and major generative AI providers. If these agreements can, of course, create new revenue opportunities for media players and partly compensate for some of them the disintermediation negative impact. We believe that this type of agreements can also create a risk for smaller independent publisher that could be excluded from these negotiations and thus from future AI-mediated visibility channels. So quickly to end on infrastructures, in this report we also highlight the different concentration dynamics throughout the AI value chain at the level of infrastructures, computing power, data access, foundation models, and on. And because of this dynamics, hyperscalers may benefit from competitive advantages. And in some situation, cloud providers could also use business users' data and ecosystem and their ecosystem position to expand into adjacent AI markets, especially AI models deployment. And if this concentration dynamics continue, only a limited number of players could progressively shape the conditions under which information is produced, accessed, and distributed online. So yeah, we believe that economic regulation has a role to play to limit these risks. And I will stop there, and I will be happy to detail a little bit on the regulatory toolbox. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. It was really interesting to hear your perspective on what a regulator can do and what are the initiatives that our SAP is taking. And now I want us to move through to the civil society perspective with Corinne Kath, and especially to talk about Article 19, what Article 19 is concerned about in this landscape, and what exactly is the human rights frame in this debate. So you have the floor.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I am going to figure out the clicker as we do this, so bear with me. We are at Computer Privacy and the Data Protection Conference today, CPDP. And yet I want to talk about how a variety of computer problems today that are surfacing for freedom of expression, especially as we see the growing digitization of the media, are perhaps not problems that can be solved by privacy or data protection. And building a little bit on what Agustin and Sandrine have already set out, I want to restate two of the challenges that we really see right now for freedom of expression and access to information in particular, as the media is digitizing. And then collectively scope out whether our existing regulatory toolbox is or is not fit for purpose. And you can guess where I may land. The first challenge that we've been speaking about today is perhaps somewhat more familiar now. Let me see if this works. Perfect. It is artificial intelligence really hollowing out independent journalism. And I recently wrote a piece with my colleague Tanu, in which we look at AI crawlers and their impact. So bots that roam news websites, take content without consent, and sometimes overload the servers of the very outlets they are trying to scrape, therefore making it harder for all of us to read the news, to get access to information. The metaphor that we used in our piece is how AI bots are turning the internet into a haunted house. And so Sandrina's archive study reaches much of the same conclusion. And it's not just us, it's not just regulators, it's not just journalists, it's not just civil societies who are ringing the bell out here. It is also folks like the Wikimedia Foundation who have given multiple really great talks about how AI bots run by the big LLM companies have really increased the cost for them of hosting their information repositories, while significantly reducing the number of people who actually end up clicking through to Wikipedia's websites. And that is one problem. And the second problem is the one that Agustin has started to sketch out. And this one is perhaps a little bit less visible to all of us because we don't see it in the first instance as either consumers of the news or people who are journalists or otherwise in the media sector. And this is the one that Agustin and I researched in our joint research, which is really the growing dependence of European media on cloud computing and the impact, again, not necessarily on data protection or privacy per se, but on who controls how media outlets' digital environment works. And it's important to note that for our work, we draw really heavily from the work of Dr. Seda Gürses and her programmable infrastructures project in Delft, who are really leading the way of trying to figure out what the cloud is doing to society. What we have seen, what Agustin and I have seen, is that almost everything it now takes to produce news runs on the cloud. And that is anything from all the various things that Willem outlined, so I won't repeat them here, but it's the entire stream of making news from start to finish. And it's really important, and it's going to be obvious to this room, but we need to keep in mind that the cloud is not some weightless thing in the sky. We really need to start thinking of the cloud as a factory, as many academics have already been pointing out. It is where the digital economy is being built right now. And the problem is that media outlets and newsrooms do not own this factory or decide how it works. It's a handful of companies that do: AWS, Microsoft, and Google. So what we are seeing is that the media right now is facing a twin problem. AI is reducing the consumption of their original outputs, and in the process, quietly or loudly draining their content and their already depleted resources. The cloud, on the other hand, is quietly capturing their production. The first is somewhat louder and easier for all of us to see. The second one is very silent, structural, and the one that I want to focus on for the remainder of my intervention today. As part of my job, I get to still do a bit of academic work. And one of the things that I do is I study what happens when public interest institutions, whether that's the media or government institutions or internet governance institutions, move into the environment of hyperscaler clouds. And what we have seen, especially with organizations moving their operations to AWS, Microsoft, or Google, is three particular shifts to the nature of the organization that moves into the cloud. And I call this pattern cloud drift. Come on in, So we see three things that are shifting. The first one is expertise, as Agustin also spoke to. The people who understand their own digital environment and the mission of the organization that they work for are slowly being replaced by people who only understand the cloud provider systems and not necessarily the mission. And that means that know-how moves out towards the cloud, and by extension, so does the media's control over their own digital environment. Second one is that question of control. So your digital environment, the place where the work is actually made, and whether that is the business of government, the business of running a hospital, the business of academia, they are all now being run by your cloud provider to a certain extent. The cloud provider decides what services exist, what they cost, when they change, and you have to adapt to them. And if they change something about your digital setup that does not work for your ends or isn't congruent with your public mission, there's really very little you can do. It's a very, very unilateral decision. Once you're in, as Willem also mentioned. And the third one is purpose. So organizations, we have seen gradually absorb the logic of their cloud provider. So all of a sudden they start to think about skill and efficiency and growth. And that is not always a good fit for missions aimed at serving the public interest. And so what we have seen is that for newsrooms, for media outlets, the cloud is not a neutral utility. It really quietly shapes how journalism is produced, what it and who it is optimized for, and who holds the technical keys. And again, in our joint work, Agustin and I really point out the dangers of this for also keeping an independent European media. Now, going through some of what is at stake for freedom of expression, and there's evidently more than these three, but these are the three that I want to focus on now. The first one is fragility. Agustin also brought it up. These cloud computing systems are not perfect. There is fragility there. There are outages. There was a big outage in July of 2024. There was a big outage in October 2025 when a single AWS failure essentially took down governments, banks, messaging apps, and news outlets at the same time across the world. And so what looks like a diverse media landscape turns out to rest on 3 companies. And when one of those companies fails, large parts of the press go quiet at the same time. The second one, and this is one that we've also seen in the wild, is the power to cut off. Infrastructure providers can withdraw services, and they do. And while we know quite a bit about deplatforming at the content layer, because it's more visible, it's more contested, censorship at the infrastructure layer, including by a cloud provider stopping to provide their services to publications or to individuals, it happens. It's quiet, it's fast, and it's very hard to hold to account. And it's this type of censorship at the infrastructure layer that Article 19 has really focused on, given it's more and more prevalent across the media ecosystem and more broadly. And the third one is operational independence. So a free press, a pluralistic press, depends on operational independence. And when your digital environment belongs to a handful of corporations subject to their legal systems and their political whims, the autonomy of European journalism rests on decisions taken far outside of any newsroom here and outside the reach of any European regulator. And this is a concern that is not just purely a European one. This is something that globally the press is dealing with and needs to think through. So what can be done? I will skip through these fast because I know I'm going a little bit over time, and this would be a great thing to discuss in the next sessions of our gathering. But we need to name the full range of problems, figure out which of the tools that we have are and aren't fit for purpose, and build our alternatives like Willem is doing while being really clear-eyed about which dependencies are inevitable. Because a lot of this is not going to be a question of we can build a perfect stack that is completely separate from everything else, and it's very questionable if that is even something that you can do and that you want to do also from an environmental perspective. So it'll be a question of trade-offs. Which dependencies are we willing to accept when, under what circumstances for which institutions? And that is a debate that we can have. So to close off, I want to close with where we started, which is the twin problems that we now face in media. AI crawlers being the incredibly loud ones. We can see them. We are very right to be angry. And policy is starting to move around this. And at the same time, we are also seeing that the media's capacity to function and to function independently now rests in the hands of a few number of big tech firms. And what I want to leave you with is that a free press built on captured infrastructure is only ever going to be as free as those firms allow it to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corinne. Now we have 2 blocks of questions, of discussions with the panelists, and then we'll open the floor to a Q&A with the audience. So before that, I wanted to go a bit deeper into the vulnerabilities and harms. Meaning, what does a real vulnerability look like, and why does this matters in terms of human rights and access to information and the rights we are discussing here today, and specifically what are the harms? I mean, you've both, Augustine and Corinne, talked a bit about this, but just to be a bit more specific about why this matters. So.
Sorry, I was taking notes. Could you repeat the question? Could you repeat the question?
So just to be a bit more specific about the harms associated with dependency on hyperscalers, and why does it matters for human rights protection?
Well, I really think that there is a problem of, on the one hand, the very potential of censorship in a very real and structural level. And when your entire infrastructure depends on one provider, and that provider ceases to give you their services, that's basically putting you out of operation. And doesn't mean that it's completely unavoidable. You can rebuild it, but that takes considerable time. So that is already, I think, a very concrete and very real threat. But I think more generally, there is a problem where we're letting a handful of companies to very much overdetermine how our space for information production and distribution looks like. And these are for-profit companies, as Karim mentioned, that are not particularly interested in the public good or in public deliberation in ways that are in any way conductive towards democratic discussion and leveling out of political power. In fact, they're, on the contrary, interested in further concentration of political power, which is something that we've seen over the last years in ways that are almost cartoonishly evil, and I'm assuming that everybody in the room is more or less aware of. So in that sense, I think that those are very, very important risks. And finally, and I don't think this is a question of human rights, but I think it's a question of vision of what do we want for our society. It is a question of whether or not you have the talent to challenge that. And I think we are very much assuming that that talent is immanent and will always be there, but actually, no, you have to develop, you have to nurture it, and you have to create different spaces for that to manifest, because the person who's working in the media probably will have different interests than the person who's working in finance, the person who's working for the government, the person who's working for human rights organizations. But having people with similar expertise in all those different areas actually allows for a much healthier discussion than when everybody's simply working for hyperscalers. So yeah.
If I can quickly add another thing to that, sort of drawing back from the question of how big this problem is, because I do feel that there is quite a bit of discussion in around things like the U.S. Cloud Act and the extent to which other governments would have access to data that is hosted in clouds in Europe. And I hope that what Agustin and I have done is also broaden a little bit the number of things that we should be worried about. Because even if you have a perfect, a perfect privacy or a perfect data protection setup, or you have this like sovereign cloud, you are still in a situation in which you might have really good privacy protections, but the thing can still be turned off, right? So it is a question of and from where I sit, this particular solution of the different dependencies that exist on cloud computing companies cannot be solved with data protection and privacy regulation alone, but we must have a much broader conversation around, and this has been called many different things, resilience, etc., around like what do you do when you invite these companies, these big tech companies, into the most critical institutions within your societies: governments, education, healthcare, energy management, water, agriculture. I mean, it does not get more fundamental, and yet we don't seem to blink at doing it. And I think that has something to do with like the sort of exceptionalism that we still apply to the digital world. Whereas if I was trying to tell someone like, it's going to be an American provider that is now going to run all of the waterworks in the Netherlands, which means that they can open and close dams as they see fit, and we're just going to trust them to not flood us, people would immediately understand, that's a really bonkers solution. But when we do it with the digital services provided by our governments or our agriculture or logistics or ports or anything or healthcare, we somehow don't have that same visceral reaction. And what I'm really looking for is like trying to get through to people how big this capture is and how big the implications are, even though it always feels like it's one layer removed, because you don't necessarily see that cloud, right? You don't necessarily experience how much of our governments is already captured by this cloud until it's too late, until you do, and then we're stuck in Hotel California now managing our waterways.
Yeah, thank you. I also wanted us to discuss a bit of the regulatory approaches that we now have as possible tools or not to address this. And I don't know if Sandrine wants to talk a bit more about what would meaningful accountability for these infrastructure providers actually look like, and what do you think about this, and how the EU framework addresses this right now?
So from our perspective, the European Union already has a strong regulatory toolbox to preserve the openness and contestability of AI infrastructures and services. But the key challenge now is the implementation of these tools, but also to make sure that the frameworks effectively address the new concentration dynamics emerging across the AI value chain. So more specifically on the cloud infrastructures, the Data Act is an essential instrument against lock-in dependencies from hyperscalers. The Data Act for us can help reduce this dependencies by improving portability, interoperability, as well as switching conditions between cloud services. We also highlight that the Data Act can be used as a tool to regulate AI as a services type of services. Second, we also believe that the implementation of the DMA will be particularly important to address several risks linked to generative AI deployment. So, for instance, we believe that we should make sure that the DMA is implemented on cloud providers by the designation of hyperscalers as gatekeepers, and there are like inquiries at the European Commission that are ongoing and that might go in this direction. We also believe that we should make sure that the inclusion of AI bricks in core services platforms already regulated by the DMA are taken into account in the regulation. And last but not least, we also believe that we should consider the possibility to designate new, let's say, pure player of the AI markets as gatekeeper based on the DMA, where relevant thresholds are met, so mainly for OpenAI right now. And more broadly, discussions around the future Cloud and AI Development Act are for us a key step to create more pro-investment and open cloud market. But yeah, we wait for the proposal to make a more specific contribution on this text. And maybe to end, aside the competition and economic dynamics, we also have several complementary tools to address the risks we were highlighting regarding the relationship between content providers and generative AI. So notably, the DSA is quite an important regulation to address some of the systemic risk represented by gatekeepers, including generative AI services providers. We also have in mind the Digital Fairness Act as a possible tool to increase users' transparency in their use of generative AI, and also provide more configuration options, including regarding the sources referenced by the generative AI, especially when we are discussing media and current news type of information. And finally, aside from regulatory as itself, we believe that technical standards and international governance will play a key role for the future discussion on opening the AI infrastructures and services, and notably the work conducted by the Internet Engineering Task Force to establish more granular standards regarding data collection and, as we mentioned, remuneration payment possibilities for content providers.
Thank you, Sandrine. Anyone wants to add something to it? Or can we move to the Q&A?
I have a few simple things that I just wanted to add. Very practical. I'm a practical person. So 2 weeks ago, I was in the States. I had a chat with a cloud provider, an American big cloud provider. They said, our sovereign cloud is ready in Europe. So we've asked many of the public broadcasters and said, well, it's ready, but you need to understand it's more expensive, right? Because we needed to provide something very special for you. So of course, these guys are already under pressure. They have budget cuts. The BBC, the big BBC need to cut 2,000 people in the next year and over a few years to come, a few millions. So are they going to spend 20% more on their, I don't think so. And of course, this cloud provider said, oh, but they're not interested. Yeah, they don't have a choice. Another thing that you probably never realized, it's not an endless pit of resources. There are several times that, of course, during COVID, many people wanted to be on air. You couldn't go to the office. So we started to use the cloud, but at some point it says no GPU available. So imagine if it's critical news, something happened here in the middle of Brussels and you don't have the critical resource available to warn the public. Just a few questions we have.
So we're now gonna get a few questions from the audience. Victoria has the mic and she will go around to see if there are any questions. Anyone? If not, okay.
Hi, Nicola from FGV Law School. Thank you very much in discussion. I was triggered especially by Corinne's presentation. I didn't know about the silent revolution, you know, or the silent takeover. So I wonder if you could give us a little bit more about this in terms of how the cloud and the services of these companies are being used also in the process of news production, because we always talk, you know, more about the other visible part, but I think there's a revolution happening also within that we would like to know more. And the second issue is you mentioned also about the cutoff, the possibility that these companies do some cutoff, and this reminds me that we don't know much about the policies that are being adopted by this company in terms of how they moderate. Usually we always talk about moderation at the application layer, but is there a study that does this? Do you have any experience, for instance, any examples of cutoffs that were outrageous? I mean, it would be interesting to learn more, also to understand how this can impact freedom of expression.
Test. It works. So in terms of the cutoff, I think everyone has seen the example of Microsoft and the ICC, which is not the media, but it is a good example of how you can leverage sanctions on cloud computing companies to have them deny their services. We have seen a number of examples with incredibly right-wing fringe platforms being cut off by by AWS has done that with Parler and a couple of other ones. So it definitely happens. I don't know of any studies of cloud-specific cutoffs in Europe for the media, but Article 19 did just do a 9-month study on the domain name system, so a different part of the infrastructure, where we did find this, and we found it specifically for a number of media organizations across the globe. Belarus, Mexico, a bunch of other places. And so one of the things that in an ideal world we would like to do is pick up some more of that research, but in this particular context. So yes, it happens. Is there a need for more research? Absolutely. And for the section on going a little bit more into the silent revolution, I will hand the part for the media over to Agustin, because that is more your expertise. But I have looked at this question specifically for internet governance. And what we are seeing as like a trend is that, I mean, many industries, especially those that are not yet digitized, are being pulled into the cloud, right? They're being sold these cloud computing environments as the way to go forward. And specifically because of the financial pressures that, I mean, many are under, but the media specifically, it seems like a really interesting proposition, right? Like a lot of it is handed off. Initially, they offer you really low rates and then it increases. And that has a number of impacts on how organizations organize their work internally, what they prioritize. And I've shown for internet governance organizations that it, for instance, reduces their likelihood to be really vocal about the dangers of power in big tech. So there's a number of internet governance organizations that have shifted from running things in-house on their own servers or with local data center providers, being very, very vocal, saying like, we need to break up big tech, all of these things. And then, they make this move. And by definition, that makes it much more harder for them to be vocal advocates for a different future. And also, the thing that I find the most difficult is that for a lot of these organizations, experimentation with technology is actually part of the mandate. Right, the original people who run the internet, you want these people to try and figure out how to do things without relying on big tech, so that you can build that different infrastructure, you can build that different future that people are constantly calling for, right? When they say we need to divest from big tech, something else does need to come in its place to a certain extent, right? We're not going to put the genie of digitization back in the bottle. And these are the people with the technical know-how to do it. And they stop doing it once they move to the cloud because they no longer control their own environment. And so it becomes much harder for us to collectively build that different world that we're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, to go beyond, just to complete on the question of deplatformization, I cannot recommend enough the work by Jennifer Holt. She has a book called Cloud Policy, where she specifically looks at the way in which cloud has been regulated in the US, and overcompliance by cloud providers has been a feature very much since the mid-2000s, which explains the way in which they have been regulated with incredibly leniency. So that creates, to me, a big concern for organizations that rely on these providers, because there are providers that have a long history of over-complying with whatever the wishes of the US government happen to be at any given time. So that's Cloud Policy by Jennifer Holt. It's in open access at the MIT Press. So in terms of the silent revolution, yeah, I mean, what I think is interesting, and that's kind of like why I realized when I started doing my PhD, is that most of the media innovations that we've seen over the last decade can be directly traced to cloud-based services, both end devices, hardware, and software. And I can put like very specific examples, kind of like the way in which we saw this media convergence, where media companies that used to do only text all of a sudden started doing, radio or audiovisual productions. Like all of that was possible because there was a cheapening of media production that was tied to cloud-based infrastructures. I think Willem can speak way more about that. What I also think is quite important and quite dangerous is the fact that, as I mentioned, having access to cloud infrastructures allowed for companies to develop much more sophisticated software products, and that has come together with a broader tendency across most media markets in Europe in particular of media concentration. So like the media says, actually we're having this competition from platforms, and platforms are very unfair, they're taking away our resources, therefore we need to concentrate more. And we saw kind of like how media concentration law has been diluted over the last decade and a half. And what these bigger conglomerates do is, like, most of them are actually cloud-based, and they use the affordances of the cloud to develop more powerful, basically, data collection and analyzing infrastructures, which allows them to behave like platforms in a way. And that, on the perspective of individual rights, I also find that actually quite problematic, because not only there is a concentration of opinion power, which is already problematic, there's also a reproduction of some of the most pernicious aspects of the platform economy happening in the media. So that's also something to take into consideration when we think about the silent revolution. But yeah, I don't know if, Willem, you want to say more about media production?
I'll try to make a very long story very short, but just financials. the tech industry, that's specifically in media and entertainment, that's around 51 billion. Sounds like a large number, but the IT industry is 4.64 trillion. Those were the figures I found a few months ago. Now, meaning if I'm a startup, I'm going to go to the IT industry, right? Because there's much more chance that I get a revenue. And we're such a small business, and there are not a lot of customers, and there are tools that everybody of us needs, like broadcasters, and that's called an asset management system. Now, if I'm trying to develop such a system that collects all the footage you have and all the content that belongs to it, all the metadata that belongs to it, the journalist, who did you interview, then you probably want to develop it on Amazon, because Amazon provides services that you can rapidly build and develop. Well, once you do this, of course, you're rapid to the market, you deliver your product, but well, then you're stuck to the cloud. And this is just a system that collects your footage, but you also have a news system that collects the stories that you're going to give, and that orders this, how the presenter is going to give this on the news story at 7 o'clock. These are now becoming cloud-based systems as well. And it delivers value because you can summarize with AI, and suddenly you have AI that will do the rough cutting of the footage that you just shot here in the streets concerning whatever event. So this is also interesting for a broadcaster, right? Because you spend less resources on creating more material, but suddenly all these things just creep in, and at the end, well, you're stuck.
And maybe very quickly, getting back on the issue of censorship, we mainly discussed the political reasoning that could be behind this kind of practices, and of course, it's the main challenges. The main challenge when we discuss the freedom, the impact on freedom of expression. But I just want to outline that. Commercial policies, economic interests are also motivations from digital intermediaries to limit the visibility of specific media providers or publishers. For instance, getting back to generative AI services, in the test we realized we notably ask 16,000 of questions to different AI services, and we noted that for the questions that were related to political events or current events, there were an underrepresentation of media publishers in comparison with the search engine. Because of other discussion going on between publishers and AI services providers. So this should be also looked at when discussing this topic. Thank you.
Thank you all. We still have time for a round of questions from the audience. Isa?
Yes, thank you. I'm Maria Luisa Stasi. I work for Article 19, and I'm a competition lawyer by background. Apologies if this has been discussed in the first part of the panel. I arrived a bit late. I'd like to pick up on what, Willem, you said just before the end of the panel, before opening to the Q&A, when you said, well, you know, you want a different infrastructure, is there available, 20% more. How many, you know, actors will actually go for it? My question is about the fact that it's about the framing, I suppose. That 20% more in terms of prices means something, or it could be associated, hopefully, eventually, with independence, autonomy, self-determination. And in the current framing, it seems that those issues, they should come for free. But I don't see why we've come to this point, because in the past, we've always traditionally used, in Europe and elsewhere, concepts like public interest, public services, service of general economic interest, and they all come with a price. There are so many different issues in various sectors, from education to media to others, where we factor in the value, the price, so to speak, of those values. And public procurement, for example, in many sectors and many instances, the public administration don't go for the cheapest price, but it goes from the most competitive based on a number of factors. And it seems to me that when we talk about cloud, we have completely eliminated this. Like in a second, in a day, it disappeared. Which is a bit counterintuitive, because when we talk about digital in general, and especially digital services at a higher level, we took 20 years and more, but we came to the conclusion the price is not a big issue because many of these services are given for free, but we're paying in any case. There are costs. It's just they're not quantifiable in terms of a dollar or a euro or whatever. So this mismatch, I would go as far as to argue that is a framing that makes things go smoother. So maybe we need to change the framing if we want to go and point fingers and try to build alternatives.
Before giving the floor for you to answer Isa's question, I wanted to ask as well about next steps, what comes next in terms of what happens to the cloud environment, and also ask you to give your final remarks because we're running out of time.
I just wanted to give a quick response. So I've been part in a few tender processes, probably the last 63 for one new builder, not too far away. And the most points are always at price, even if it's a tender process and you feel as a technologist, well, this is important. If you take a step back, for a broadcaster, they always value the media and not how to make it. And it's this, let's say, gap between those. People are thinking, we produce media and how, that's just a side topic. But that's not true, not in a digital age. That should be really be brought together. And I've seen a few organizations that's really detached from each other, and like innovation, that's something weird on the side. But no, it's not. And if we start to look at our silos, it will not happen. But we need to work together and understand each other's problems. Otherwise, well, we're stuck in this game.
Sandrine?
Shortly, as mentioned, there are several texts already adopted or that are going to be discussed in the next years that will be key to work on the openness of AI infrastructures and services. So this will be the main step to take, and also maybe to outline one point. It is important to work towards creating a level playing field among the different distribution channels of information. So after the tools that have been created to try to extend the pluralism and openness principle to digital intermediaries, including search engines, now it's time to also raise the question regarding generative AI, which is becoming a new distribution channel for publishers and information. Thank you.
Thank you. Augustine?
Yeah, I mean, I can only echo what Willem said. Is this on? Yeah. I can only echo what Willem said in terms of there is a problem that we focus on the media. We don't focus on the production of media. I think that's a massive issue, and it's not just an issue for broadcasters. I think it's an issue for, I'm not going to say that the people here are the general public, because it's a very specialized public. But precisely because it is a very specialized public, I will encourage each one of you to consider this issue further, because I really think that we need to have a much more comprehensive way of thinking about the politics and political economy of infrastructure. So yeah, that basically throwing the ball to you.
Great. I think I will end on, I guess, also a call to the audience. I think what we've really been trying to do today is broaden the debate. And the business model of the cloud is not one of capitalist surveillance. Like, it is not one of enshittification. A lot of the very, very good frameworks that we have to think about the negative impact of a datafied economy don't apply well to cloud computing and its business model. And so what I would like to call everyone here is to think through what else is needed and make sure that we actually understand what this new economy is and does, especially for institutions that we all deeply cherish and that we need to protect.
You, Corinne. Well, with these final remarks, I would like to thank you very much, all the panelists that accepted to be here, and the audience for the presence here today. We had a really interesting discussion. I've learned a lot, and I hope we will see you all soon and later today. Well, thank you.
Thank you.